Hello and welcome back. This is the week 6 lecture. So, hopefully, by now we have all submitted the final draft of Essay 1. So, before we move on to our next writing style, we are beginning Unit 2 here today. But before we do that, I would just like to take a moment to sort of reflect back on Essay 1 before we leave that aside for good. One thing I like to do after we turn in all of our major essays, I like for you guys to just take a few minutes to sort of think back on your writing process. Just think about how the essay went for you. How do you feel about it? This is something I do in my live classes, and I actually have my students write a brief reflection in class. They don't turn it in. It's just sort of like a diary entry. It's like journaling. It's a little tougher to do that in an online class. So I would just encourage you guys to spend a few minutes, maybe jot a few things down, or you can just think about Essay 1, but just think about how it went. And, it's important to think about yourselves as writers while you're in this class, even if you don't particularly like writing, even if you don't think you're very good at it, it doesn't matter, because as long as you're in this class, you are writing. We're obviously writing every week. So you need to think of yourselves as writers, and you need to get into the habit of sort of evaluating yourselves and evaluating your writing. And obviously, I'll be evaluating it too. But before I grade Essay 1, it could be good for you to just set down some ideas about how it went, how you feel, and maybe what grade you expect to get on the assignment. And then you can see if your expectations sort of match up with my evaluation. But I really encourage you to think about your own personal process. Like, did you go through all the major stages of the writing process that we talked about weeks ago, as recently as last week, I think? Did you spend time on pre-writing? Did you have an outline? Did you give yourself enough time to draft? Did you leave yourself enough time to do post-writing? A lot of students don't, and that's okay, because what you need to remember is that we are trying to grow and progress as writers. So not everything always goes right. Sometimes not everything goes right with Essay 1, and that's okay as long as you learn from the experience, as long as you sort of identify the areas where you need to improve, and then you can try to improve on them with future essays. So that's kind of the goal. We want to progress over the course of the semester. We really want our essays to get progressively better. So it can be nice to have sort of a written record of how you think you did on each assignment, so you can see your own growth over the course of the semester. But like I said, even if you don't want to write it down, just spend 5 minutes or so thinking about Essay 1, thinking about what you think you did well, and also maybe some of those areas where you need to improve. But we are leaving narrative, and we are moving ahead to our next writing genre, our next style of writing, which will be analysis. So we're going to spend the next few weeks working on analytical writing, which in many ways is quite different from what we were just doing with narrative. So we're going to be learning some new terms and concepts. We're going to be learning some new techniques, some new strategies that will help us conduct good, strong analysis. So much like narrative and description, analysis is a type of writing that you can really find all over the place. It's pretty common, and it's obviously a very important skill to possess if you're a student as you move through your academic careers. So the ability to analyze will help you in a variety of different contexts. It's not specific to any one discipline, to any one field of study. So it really doesn't matter what your major is or what your area of interest is. Analysis will be a skill that you need. It's a skill that you need to practice and develop, because it will come in handy both in future classes and potentially in the workplace. So just to think a little bit about what the word means, it might help to know that the word analysis comes from an ancient Greek word for undo. To undo something means to take it apart, to disassemble it. And that's pretty much what we are doing when we analyze. We are taking something apart, whatever it is that we're analyzing, and as we're going to see, we can analyze pretty much anything. So when we analyze, we are breaking something down into its individual parts or elements. So sometimes this is literal, like if we're analyzing a car engine, we really can take it apart literally with our hands using tools. We can literally do that. In other cases, we mean this figuratively. Like if we're analyzing a work of literature or a movie, we can still break it down into its individual parts. But now we sort of mean that more figuratively. But the principle is the same. We break down our subject of analysis into all of its individual parts and elements. Then we examine those parts and elements. We figure out how they work, and we figure out the relationships between the different parts and elements. And then ultimately, we'll be able to sort of put the thing back together again. We will reassemble it because now we understand how the whole thing works. So by understanding those individual parts or elements, we'll be able to figure out how the whole thing functions. And that's ultimately the goal of analysis, is to arrive at a greater understanding of whatever it is that we are analyzing. And again, we can analyze pretty much anything. But as writers, when we start working on our own analysis, what we're trying to do is we're trying to provide a new perspective or new information to our readers. So we are trying to show readers how something works, how something functions, how something does whatever it is that it is supposed to do. And that's ultimately the goal of analysis. It's to allow us to really dig deeper and arrive at a greater understanding of things. We can usually get a pretty good surface level understanding of things just by a quick glance. But with analysis, we're sort of going beneath the surface to a certain extent. And we're sort of arriving at our own original conclusions and interpretations. We're not just going to rely on common assumptions or surface level appearances. We're going to dig a little bit deeper and arrive at a greater understanding. And then once we possess that understanding as writers, we'll be able to express it, to share it with our readers. And that's why analysis is valuable. Not only do you, the analyzer, not only do you arrive at a greater understanding, but once you put it in writing, once you put it in essay form, you can share it with others, you can educate others, you can help others to understand. So that's what we're working towards eventually. So if you look in the week 6 overview, you'll see our key terms and concepts for this week. We don't have many. We're going to keep analysis pretty simple. We don't have as many elements as we had with narrative, but we do need to understand everything that I've listed in the overview. So obviously, we'll start with the subject of analysis. And this is pretty easy to understand. This is just the thing that you are analyzing. So I've actually provided a list in the module of a few different potential subjects. And I actually want you guys to pick one of those for a little activity that we can do at the end of lecture. But as you can see from that list, we can analyze almost anything. We can analyze mechanical or sort of technological devices, things that were built to perform certain functions like computers, like engines. I think I put a bicycle on there. So we can always analyze machines, things that have been built, and we can see how that works. We can understand how these machines work by breaking them down into their individual parts and sort of examining those parts, understanding the relationships between those parts, and then we'll understand how the whole thing, the whole subject that we've chosen, whether it's a bicycle, an engine, a sport, a book, a movie, a commercial, we'll be able to understand how the whole thing works based on our examination of those individual parts. So I've listed a whole bunch of different subjects. Some are like games. We can always analyze games like sports or video games or even board games. We'll talk a little bit more today about what we call cultural products. That's kind of a broad category, but that includes things like works of literature, movies, TV shows, graphic novels. So a lot of the things that we've been reading, even in 50 essays, would qualify as cultural products. These can be works of fiction or nonfiction, but they're often sort of creatively or imaginatively done. And just, sticking with the essays in our book, those are all cultural products. They were all, originally appearing in magazines or newspapers or maybe collections of stories. They're written by professional writers, and a lot of them are narratives, as we've seen. So we can always analyze narratives. We can analyze essays, stories, movies. But with cultural products, typically our analysis will look a little bit different than it might look with a mechanical subject. Like I said, an engine or a car or a bicycle. So the procedure is the same. That's what's great about analysis. Once we learn the basic procedure, we can apply it to virtually any subject under the sun. It doesn't matter. So what's going to be maybe fun, hopefully fun, about Essay 2 is that you guys can really choose to write about something you're interested in. I mean, hopefully that was true with Essay 1 as well. But with Essay 2, you can sort of cater to your own strengths or interests or knowledge. So if you're into cars, if you work on cars, you can analyze cars. If you have a show that you really like and you want to write about it, you can analyze that show. It really doesn't matter. You can analyze food. You can analyze relatively simple things. You can also, analyze very complex, sophisticated things. So once we learn this procedure, we're going to see just how versatile this kind of analytical writing really can be. It can apply to almost any situation. That's why it's such a good thing for us to learn. So, we'll come back to that list of subjects, potential subjects, in a moment. But just remember, that's what we start with. We have to pick something to analyze. It has to be something specific. It doesn't necessarily have to be a tangible thing that we can actually pick up and hold. But of course, those work well. It can also be a cultural product. So we'll talk more about those. Let's move on and just talk about the principle of analysis, also called the framework of analysis. So this sounds kind of complicated, but it's really not. All this means is the structure that you use, the basic framework that you are going to use to analyze your chosen subject. So depending on what kind of subject you have, you might need to narrow your focus a little bit. And you might have to decide what exactly it is that you want to analyze, what exactly it is you want to show your readers. So with some simple devices or subjects, it's really not hard to figure out. So I use the example of the bicycle. We can analyze a bicycle to figure out how it works. I mean, most of us already understand, but let's say an alien is visiting from another galaxy and they've never seen a bicycle before. It would be pretty easy for us to explain how a bicycle moves, how we propel a bicycle down the road, but we would still have a framework or a structure for our analysis. So we would try to explain how the bicycle achieves movement. And in order to explain that, we're going to have to break it down into some key parts or elements. So again, in this case, that's literal. Like these are literally parts of the bicycle. So we would talk about the wheels. We would talk about the pedals, I'm guessing. We would talk about the handlebars. Maybe if there are gears on the bicycle, we would need to include those. Again, this won't take long. A bicycle is pretty easy to understand. It's not a super complex device, but we still have to break it down into at least 4, maybe 5 different elements or parts, and we'll kind of explain each one of those parts, and then we'll explain how they sort of all work together. And then once we've done all of that, we've pretty much explained the bicycle, and the alien should understand. So our analysis is successful. But that's basically all I mean by a framework. It's the structure that you use, and that's how you know which elements, which parts to focus on. Because it's conceivable that if you were doing this analysis for your alien friend, you might not need to include every single part of the bike. There might be a few elements that aren't essential in order for you to explain how bicycles work. So maybe this bicycle has a basket on it, or maybe you don't need to really talk about the spokes on the wheels or even the seat. Maybe those elements don't really play a part in your analysis because your framework, your principle of analysis is movement. I'm trying to explain how this thing achieves movement. So that's your focus. That might not include every single part of the bicycle. So your framework, once you decide what it is, that framework helps you to sort of zero in on the key elements, the key parts that you need to explain and focus on. Now with a bicycle, again, there's just not that many different parts. There's not a ton of different elements, so you might be able to cover all of them in your analysis. But think about a more complex machine like a car. So a car has more individual parts or elements than a bicycle does. And if your goal is to explain how a car achieves movement, how a car goes, you're going to focus on a few key elements and parts. You might not include every single thing that's included in a car, but you're going to talk about the engine, the transmission, I don't know, whatever else is a part of your framework, whatever else is a part of the structure that you're using. Every analysis has to be organized. And this way, they're kind of like narratives. So we talked about how with your narrative, you have all these different events of your plot, you have all of these characters, all of these different things that are happening, but you have to put all of that together into some kind of structure or some kind of a sequence in order for it to make sense to your readers. So it's the same with analysis. You have all these parts, but if you're not careful, you're going to sort of end up all over the place. If you're just looking at a part here, an element there, another part there, you need to have a structure that keeps you organized. And usually that structure is determined simply by what you're trying to accomplish in your analysis. So if you're trying to show how a car moves, then your framework, your structure is movement, and that means you're going to focus on all the parts, all the elements that go into that have a role in that. You're going to explore them individually, you're going to explore their relationships, and then you're going to be able to explain how this overall thing, this car, really works. But while you're doing that, maybe you don't talk about the upholstery. Maybe you don't talk about certain features inside the car that aren't directly connected to the movement. They don't fit inside your framework. So depending on what kind of subject you're working with, it might be very easy to choose a framework because the device just might not be very complicated, and there's just not that many different parts. There's not that many different things that the device does. So your framework might kind of be selected for you, like it is with a bicycle or to a certain extent with a car. But if we're looking at cultural products, not machines, but cultural products like books or movies, essays, comics, then it's a kind of a different deal because we have a lot more freedom when it comes to choosing our principle of analysis, that framework. It's really up to us because there's a lot of different things that we can look at, a lot of different things that we can analyze. So if you're looking at a short story or one of the narratives in 50 essays, you can really pick from a lot of different potential frameworks. You might really be interested in a particular group of characters and sort of what those characters represent, what those characters do, the larger importance of those characters to the overall narrative point. So your structure, your framework is going to be centered around these 3 or 4 characters, and the individual parts or elements that you're looking at will be the individual characters and maybe some key character traits or qualities that they possess or certain things that they do. So that's going to be the structure of your analysis. That will look a little bit different than an analysis of a car or a car engine, because again, we can even get more specific. We can look at individual parts of a car and analyze those, and because they have individual parts as well. So the options are limitless. But if we're looking at books, movies, any kind of cultural product, we're basically just choosing the angle or the structure that will give us a chance to focus on what we're most interested in. So if it's these particular characters in this one narrative, great. If it's the setting in this particular TV show, then that's going to be the structure or the framework for our analysis, and we're going to look at all the parts that go into that to that setting. Or if we're looking at different examples of imagery or symbolism, we can collect a whole bunch of different symbols. Our framework is all about symbols, symbolism. We have 4 or 5 different symbols. We're going to explore each one of them. We're going to see what they say, what they mean, why they're important, and ultimately they're going to explain to us how the narrative point of the overall narrative is working. So, our subject is the show, but our framework is going to be symbolism in the show. And our individual parts will be all of those different examples and all the cool stuff that's happening with symbolism that we've found. So through our analysis, we're going to arrive at a better, more complete understanding of the show, right? Our framework gives us the focus, it gives us the individual parts, but then our goal is to use what we learned from our elements, from that larger framework, to understand the entire subject, the entire show, the entire movie, the entire car or a bicycle, whatever it is. So just keep these relationships in mind. The subject is the bicycle. The framework is how the bicycle achieves motion, and then the individual elements are the pedals, the handlebars, the wheels, whatever else. And that's the same basic procedure that we go through with the show. It's just that with the show, our framework won't be how does it go. The framework will be characters, symbolism, imagery, or some other aspect of narrative. And then our elements, like we've seen, will be characters, or they'll be examples from the text that we can look at, talk about, think about, and then eventually we're going to explain things. We're going to put everything back together and explain how this larger subject works. So just remember, it doesn't matter what you're analyzing, we use these same steps and we follow this same procedure. So that's pretty much it as far as new material. What I want you guys to do now is just choose one of those subjects that I've listed in the week 6 module, in the overview. Just pick one, anyone, it doesn't matter, and let's just practice going through this procedure. And I would like you to write this stuff down. It's just practice, and you can even just do it right now as I'm talking. You don't have to spend a ton of time on it, but let's just get comfortable with the procedure, and then we'll kind of practice some more with our upcoming discussion posts. But for now, just choose one of those subjects and then write it down on a piece of paper or maybe into a Word doc. And then think about your framework of analysis. Think about the principle. We're going to use those terms interchangeably. Principle, framework, same thing. Just think about the structure. What are you going to focus on? Okay, how are you going to organize it? So once you've chosen your subject, just think about it for a moment and think about what it is that you want to explain to your audience. What aspect of this thing? And again, some of these things are simple. Some of these subjects are simple. They really only do one thing. So you won't have to think very hard. You'll pretty much know instantly what you're trying to show, so you'll know what your framework is, and then you can start listing all of the elements or key parts. But with some of the subjects that I listed, there are a couple of different potential frameworks that you can choose. So make your selection, and then once you have your framework written down, just jot that down underneath the subject of analysis. Once you have that framework in mind, start listing all of the key elements, all of those key parts, whether they be literal parts that you can hold in your hands or characters or examples of imagery, whatever. It just depends on what you are analyzing. But try to list as many parts as possible. You want a nice lengthy list, and that's really all you have to write down. You don't have to produce an essay yet, but just kind of look at what you've produced at each step. You have the subject, you have the framework, and then you have a list of elements or parts that you would need to discuss and describe in order to understand this overall thing, this subject that you have chosen. So once you get comfortable with this procedure, we can start doing it in a lot of different contexts. And you'll have a chance to practice more with the discussion posts. We're getting back into those. Just remember, we don't have discussion posts on the weeks where we have a major essay due, but we will be doing discussions every other week. So you have one this week, and then next week, we're going to start talking about process analysis, which is a specific type of analysis, kind of a subgenre of this genre of writing. If you think of analytical writing or analysis as the larger genre, the process analysis is a particular subtype that we're going to look at next week. And it will, again, give us a chance to write about things that we know, things that we like, but we will be following the same basic analytical procedure. So let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you next week.